It's the Progress Pod, a production of the Franklin County Coalition for Progress. I'm Pete Mazzoni. We are in the midst of an epidemic. In the U.S., in 2016, there were a reported 63,000 opioid overdoses leading to death. And nearly two-thirds of these deaths were by a legally prescribed opioid or an illicitly obtained drug. People are getting addicted to opioids and dying at rates we have never seen before. More Pennsylvanians have died from overdose than from fatal vehicle accidents, and the numbers are growing. Today, we're going to discuss the problem as it exists here in Franklin County with District Attorney Matt Fogal. So let's get started. Help us by defining what these drugs are. What is an opioid?
Sure. Typically, as far as the illicit use goes, it's heroin. Mm-hmm. These days, we're seeing more of what's called a synthetic opioid called fentanyl. Mm-hmm. There's also another level of synthetic opioid called carfentanil. And both of the latter two are synthetic, as I said, oftentimes imported. Historically, fentanyl has had a legitimate use for pain relief, oftentimes an end-of-life situation.
End of life, so it's a very, very powerful
Very much
drug.
So. And heroin today is not new. We've heard of heroin for many years.
Yeah.
Today, the heroin is much more potent, much more dangerous. Fentanyl is much more dangerous than that heroin. Carfentanil is the most dangerous, and it has been used as an opioid illicitly, oftentimes not knowingly by whoever the user is, but it's sometimes referred to as an elephant tranquilizer. Quite literally, it's
charming,
about as potent as you can get.
Now, are those two drugs prescribed legally and then find their way into the illegal markets, or?
Fentanyl in particular has historically been used in the medical community for pain relief. It oftentimes historically has come in a patch form. And even then, we have seen over the years, for example, someone who develops an opioid use disorder becoming so addicted and desperate to receive that, sometimes stealing those types of patches from their loved ones who may have them for legitimate pain relief just because of that desperation to get them. So we have seen that. Heroin obviously is an illicit drug in and of itself. Sometimes a purchaser of heroin receives fentanyl unknowingly. And so that started happening here in 2016. We had our first fentanyl overdose death. That was in March of 2016, and we were waiting on toxicology results. There were needles around and presumably what appeared to be heroin at the crime scene where the deceased was. And so the toxicology came back negative for that. And so we were a little befuddled by that. Given the particular panel of testing we were accustomed to doing at the time, we decided to run a different kind of a panel and include fentanyl, and sure enough, that's what it was. And so it's been here since then. It's more common in our overdose deaths here in Franklin County than regular heroin at this point. There are other opioids as well, legitimately prescribed, Percocet, OxyContin, that sort of thing, that clearly have a legitimate use and have for a while, but as most people know, have been also abused as well. They're very heavily addictive.
They're also prescribed fairly easily and quickly. Is my understanding that you go in with back pain and you come out with something of that nature, whether it's an oxycodone or I know that I fractured my collarbone and was given prescriptions for all kinds of heavy drugs that I didn't take part of. But all right, let's get into what you're doing to combat the problem.
Well, if I could just jump back on that. Sure. I think there is some history there with some over-prescribing or mis-prescribing. And the medical community has taken some lumps recently to account for that. And I can say, having dealt with the medical community here and on a state level, that they are very cognizant of this problem, have been for a number of years now, and have implemented practices to curtail that. There's more education now within medical school regarding addiction, generally speaking, and there are measures that are taken operationally within health networks to limit overprescription of these types of pills.
Let's get right into that.
Sure.
That's the first topic I want to talk about. The Pennsylvania's Prescription Drug Monitoring Program collects information on all filled prescriptions for controlled substances. So tell us how that works and how you monitor, and is it working?
It just began in the last few years. We were the last state in the country to implement it. And so given how long that it has been in use, we don't have a lot of hard data yet to know the effectiveness of it specifically here in Pennsylvania. We do know how it's been utilized in other states. We studied that sort of thing before it began here, and it's been successful other places, so we suspect it will be. But basically how it works is that when someone is given a prescription, and just making this very basic, it's entered into a database that can then be seen by future or other potential prescribers who would provide treatment. The basis for it really is the drugs were so powerful.
Yeah.
And some people didn't realize that. They were marketed a certain way, and that's maybe a whole other podcast. But
I'm sure it is.
They entered the stream of commerce, such as they did, and became something that was utilized. And so sometimes historically people would develop that addiction, and their doctor would maintain that they didn't need more of it. And so you would hear the term doctor shopping. Someone would go to another doctor who was maybe a little bit more liberal with their prescribing practices. And so this is what would be eliminated, hopefully, with the implementation of the PDMP.
So what does it take to trigger an action by your office? If, there's got to be HIPAA laws running here.
That's a great question in the sense that my office is a law enforcement agency, and what we would prosecute is any unlawful delivery of a controlled substance. And so in that situation, I don't monitor the PDMP. That's a different entity, and it leads me to say that where we are right now, particularly with respect to Franklin County, is that even though I'm a law enforcement officer working with police, et cetera, as I do in a traditional role, we have such a collaborative effort in this county that there are a lot of non-traditional hats that I wear from day to day and throughout the day. I am the chair of the overdose task force since 2016. And we have a very team-oriented, multidisciplinary, collaborative approach. And so I don't have a direct role within the PDMP, but certainly as part of that collaborative, and aware of that.
So there's people working within that program that would be looking for those red flags that they would report up the food chain.
That's right.
So it sounds like you built in a buffer to kind of keep things HIPAA compliant. It's not you and your office monitoring what doctors are doing.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes, we do not have eyes on that sort of information.
Let's get right into Get Back Up.
Mm-hmm.
So we addressed the first one, the PDMP, and the number 2 item here is Operation Save a Life. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Operation Save a Life is a program run through Healthy Communities Partnership here locally. Mm-hmm. They're a very important member of the team with the Overdose Task Force. They're a very important member of the community in general, for that matter. They train local citizens on the proper use of naloxone. I believe now they are also making it available for distribution within those training sessions.
Can I just stop you there?
Absolutely.
Let's get a good definition on naloxone.
Sure. Naloxone is a substance which is now carried by police officers as well as all of our medic units here in the county. It's not necessarily new. Generally, it's been introduced here in 2016. And essentially what it does is when someone is experiencing an overdose event, it can be administered to that person who's in distress and block the effect of the opioid. And so oftentimes they're referred to as reversals when that happens, and it's not technically what happens. Not to get too much into the science about what's happening to someone's brain, but the opioid effect within the brain is stopped, and so there's a blocking that the naloxone effect has, and so it's no longer having that typical opioid effect. And so we talk about it in terms of reverse because someone who is just about to die or has technically died is no longer in that situation. So, but technically it's not a reversal, it's a blocking. And the reason that's important is the effect of naloxone is about a half hour. And so if police or medics go to someone's house and administer naloxone and then nothing else happens after that, chances are once that naloxone wears off, it stops blocking the effect of the heroin or fentanyl, and then they could have a subsequent overdose. And so in those situations, we make sure that those individuals go to a hospital,
right
for more
away.
treatment. Sure.
Does the county have any problems obtaining it or paying for it? Because it sounds like it's the drug that's going to save a life.
Sure. Well, I do know that in my professional life, we certainly have obtained it rather easily. There was an initiative with Capital Blue Cross that made that available for a lot of law enforcement entities throughout South Central PA. And so starting in 2016, we introduced that here. Basically, we obtained it for free. I can't speak for the county Drug and Alcohol Office and what sorts of financial restrictions they've had or challenges they've had with that. I do know that it is available to the general public. There's a standing prescription from our state level saying that anybody, you don't have to have an individual prescription. Everybody basically has one.
All right, let's keep moving through the Get Back Up. You've got the number 3 item there is the prescription pill take back posters in pharmacies. So this is where I guess you're asking people just on their own, put your pills in this container or what have you.
Yeah, so we have 4 police departments throughout the county that have these boxes. We have Mercersburg Police Department, Chambersburg, Waynesboro, and Greencastle, all with these boxes that are accessible, some 24 hours a day, others typical business hours. And so, again, that's an initiative we partnered with the state on for destruction of those pills. So basically it's a big box that in a secure way we can keep people's pills when they need to get rid of them. And the reason it's important is that as you can assume, I think you've mentioned, you don't want these types of very dangerous pills lying around.
Right.
And so someone may have been prescribed them legitimately, didn't need to use them all, and so they're just sitting there. Well, they're very dangerous to just sit there because someone else could get into them purposefully or not, and then bad things happen. And so rather than flushing them down the toilet, they should really be properly disposed of in one of these boxes. There's no question asked. There's not a person there standing,
even if they
taking
put
your
their
name.
prescription in and has their name on it, you're not going to pursue it.
No, they're all
Right.
collected and destroyed. So it's important not to flush them. I want to make that crystal clear. They're going to go into the water system, and we're going to have 3-headed fish and a Conica jig, which we don't really want to have.
Next up is youth prevention. So I imagine you're going out and you're just making kids. Now, what ages do you target? Do you target high schoolers, or do you target, middle schoolers and up? Or
we don't exclude any particular age range. Studies have shown right now, in this day and age, that the most effective age to target is that middle school range. Middle school, yeah. It's not to say that they're writing off, the high school audience either, but just in terms of effectiveness, it's pretty standard to target the middle school age range. Historically, we've had programs like DARE where police would go in and explain drugs and alcohol and other things to a younger demographic. But we do that. We have done this sort of thing for a long time, and Healthy Communities Partnership has really taken the lead in our community doing that. We recently, last August, we had a bigger event that the Overdose Task Force sponsored at the Cash's auditorium. There was a gentleman by the name of Chris Herron who came and spoke. We had received some money by way of donation and utilized that to bring in this speaker. He's got a tremendous story. If you go online, you can find it on an old 30 for 30 from ESPN. He is a...
well, that's a great show. I'm just going to interject right here. I love 30 for 30, but go on.
Yeah, great. So his name is Chris Herron, and he was a basketball player, grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and was actually on the cover of Sports Illustrated with Allen Iverson.
Playing for the Celtics by chance?
He eventually did, and so he went to college and tried drugs, with cocaine at the time, and throughout the course of the next number of years of his life, experimented with different drugs. Eventually, he did get out of college, was drafted into the NBA, and eventually did play for the Boston Celtics, his hometown team, and dear to my heart. And eventually then his use then led to opioids and heroin specifically, and his life was essentially destroyed at that point, in and out of jail, accidents, his career in shambles, his family, a wreck and grieving. So he came here and told his story, and we had about 1,000 people in the auditorium that night, and he was such a good speaker. We hear these days that programs like Scared Straight may not be that effective.
That's what I've heard. They don't really work. And
so I want to be clear. His isn't really a Scared Straight. It's a look at what happened to me. Yeah. And that's part of it. But the second part of it is where he opens it up for questions. And having walked through that fire and come through the other side, and he's been in recovery a number of years now, and his life is dedicated to helping others. He keeps it very down to earth. And I found that the people that I love to talk to most about this issue are people who are on the other side through that fire and can tell me exactly how that felt as best they can, what worked for them, why it began, why it continued, why it stopped and how it stopped, and how they stay sober now. I'm just so much more informed by somebody who's been through it. And so he really connects with the audience and keeps it very real and down to earth, as I said. And so I talked with him a bit afterwards. I took him back to his hotel and we chatted a little bit, and it occurred to me, I'm sure he's heard this 100 times, but the 17-year-old young man inside of me who thinks about him probably dreaming of playing for the Boston Celtics, and he gets there and just blows it. Yeah. And but his life now, after having that failure, I guess, if you want to call it that, professionally in basketball, his life has so much more purpose than it ever would putting a ball through a hoop. He's helped to probably literally save lives by his efforts now.
And you feel like the audiences are receptive to his message? And
very much so, and we'd like to bring him back, particularly into the schools. This was an evening session where we had anybody in the community could come. It was free. And so we would like to see him come back and do some special sessions, like assemblies in different schools throughout the county. So that's one in particular sort of special preventative measure that we've taken.
Yeah, what we've been going through here in this first part is all your preventative measures. So let's move on to now your treatment and recovery measures that you have in the program. So the number one item here is Noah's House. Can you tell us about Noah's House and what they do and how that works? And one other question as we move into this.
Sure.
Not everybody who ends up incarcerated gets to be in these programs once we're in treatment and recovery. Is that correct? I mean,
that's right. Well, look, someone who may be abusing drugs may not ever touch the criminal justice system. Chances are they've done something, but that's not always necessarily the case. And sometimes maybe you're not caught. So not everyone in recovery necessarily has a criminal justice background. But no, to answer your question, not everyone at Noah's House, for example, and now Gracie's Place for women here in Chambersburg just recently opened. Not everyone there is coming there after having, in other words, it's not a home plan as some people refer to things when you come out of jail. There's people there who just need to go there. They were in treatment, needed a place to go in a sober living environment.
So that's what it is. It's a sober living environment?
Yes.
Okay.
And that started a couple of years ago. It was our first certified recovery home. The state has worked on certification of that, but before the certification from the state, which will be coming this summer, we had some standards that were state level and national standards, and Noah's House happened to meet them. It was the first such entity we've had here. We probably need 30 of them, unfortunately.
30 versions of Noah House at
Sure.
Gracie's house.
We do, yeah. Treatment as a necessity is probably understood. Like, people would have been familiar with someone or some circumstance you've heard of where someone needs to go to rehab. You may have heard that kind of a phrase.
Sure.
And so that's not something that is unusual for the public to hear. What my eyes were opened with was the need for recovery housing, and the idea really that recovery is a thing, and it's a lifetime thing, and it's something that needs to be nurtured, recognized, and fostered. And so in our community, where it's not us and them and that sort of thing, it's all us. We're one community, and so there are citizens in the community that we need to set up for success as best we can. And so when I say we need 30 might be high. I don't know. It's probably not. But we have a capacity for 14 residents at Noah's House, 10 at Gracie's Place, and recovery is very important. The recovery community is very important. And again, it's those people that I said I love to hear their stories and learn what was successful for them and what was unsuccessful. Oftentimes, the first thing isn't the thing that works. Maybe it's a couple of times, which is very frustrating.
Well, relapse is common, isn't it?
It's not uncommon, that's for sure.
Especially with these highly addictive drugs. So we move on from Noah's House. Now we go to what's called peer support recovery specialist. That sounds like a one-on-one situation.
Again, it is someone in recovery to someone who hopes to reach the stage of recovery, someone who's in active use, just out of active use, and having someone, you've heard of the term sponsor, I suspect, through the AA program. It's that sort of thing, basically. More technically administered than a sponsor. It's a professional position, and there's some training involved in certification, but it's having that person to support you who authentically can tell you how they got to where they are, what
they've
worked.
been there.
Follow me, I can show you the way.
Yeah. They've been through, as you say, been through the fire.
Right.
So they're ready to talk about it.
And really what we want to foster through graduates of treatment court, which I'm sure we'll talk about, people in this community who we work with and know who are in recovery, we want to create a network of alumni in a sense, or an army of these folks in recovery who can then marshaled together help those in our community who need to get to that next step. Because again, I think those are really the people who are the most critical to this fight that we're in.
Yeah. So you say we could use up to 30 of these different facilities, which ultimately leads to the question of what's happening to the people that are being turned away.
I don't know that, necessarily it's a matter of turning away.
Or waitlisted, what have you.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's not been a lengthy wait list for Noah's House that I'm aware of, but I think what's happening in this particular environment is that we haven't had any. And so I don't know that it's something that as many people, including someone who needs it, is even aware of as an option. And so we haven't had the circumstance where so many have come in and funneled in, there's just not enough room. I think that it's not, the community isn't educated enough to know that we even need this as badly as we do. So that could become a point where there is no room, and we do need to find options. Sometimes folks will go out of here where there are other recovery homes in other jurisdictions. It's not ideal because basically it's a transition from a treatment environment back into the community in a slow way. It's a crawl, walk, run, and it just fosters that not too much too fast back into the community where it's likely that you were engaged in some maladaptive behavior. You were maybe connected with people
exactly.
you should
They're
not
back
have been connected with.
Their community where it kind of started, so they have to be careful of that.
So, it's a way to come back to the community with some caution, setting someone up for success the best way.
So next up, we go to I'm going to skip up to the Get Back Up DA-SCA partnership. Mm-hmm. What is the SCA?
The Single County Authority. That's the Drug and Alcohol Office for the county. It's an official governmental office. But
now with this aspect, we're talking about people that are in the system.
With Get Back Up, not necessarily. In fact, no. No is the answer. Okay. So there are two different tracks for Get Back Up. Number one is if someone comes into a police department with a controlled substance, with a bundle of heroin or with some paraphernalia, whatever it is, and they say, here, you can have this, I'm surrendering it, and can you please help me? I need help. This is a health issue. Those items will be taken, eventually destroyed. No charges will be filed for that, and we will help that person get whatever help they need.
I think the idea that you've decided that this is going to be part of the program I think it's an amazing idea, that you can come in and surrender the drugs and we'll get you started. I think that's amazing, and I think it's great that you guys are doing that.
Well, it's a health issue. It really, truly is, and we have lots of different components to our overdose task force, but and law enforcement is one of them. But I don't think, as the DA, I'm saying that I don't think that the law enforcement prong is the most critical component at all. I'm often asked to go speak places about about the opioid epidemic, which is a health epidemic and crisis. But the law enforcement guy is asked to talk about. That's just because that's how we've dealt with it historically. And so we want to get to a point where it's a different environment and a different dynamic in how we're doing that. So that's one track of it. The second track is that a police officer who's investigating a crime has discretion. And that police officer, whatever the crime may be, could determine that the best outcome for this situation is this person to get help. And, perhaps but for this addiction, this person might not have done this.
Yeah, they wouldn't be making those choices.
And so in that circumstance, that officer is equipped with the discretion to call my office, get the person who works with us, who's actually an employee of the Drug and Alcohol Office, but embedded in my office, and we'll go directly there, 24/7 on call, meet with that individual, do an assessment, see what help they need. If they need long-term treatment, get on the phone and start finding a bed for that person immediately.
I want to read something from your PowerPoint presentation that I thought was really, really well stated. You said the current environment is complex and different than what we have ever previously confronted in law enforcement. It is correctly called both an epidemic and a crisis. Conventional thinking does not apply, and it is time for law enforcement to respond unconventionally on both strategic and operational levels. I thought that was really well put, and it was encouraging in the sense that it's not just, get tough on crime, kind of, lock them up and throw away the key and see what happens. It's as you're talking, it's clear that you understand your role in this process of getting these people well and back on the streets.
It's also very nuanced in making the decisions day to day, because the business model for drug trafficking of opioids, heroin in particular, is different than we're used to in law enforcement. A number of years ago, crack was more prevalent, and the business model, as I put it, was just different than it is now. Someone would come here from a major metropolitan area who didn't use, as a business proposition, decided to come here, recruit runners who may or may not have used, but as a business venture, sort of franchising here from Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. and again, not using but profiting. And so that was crack. And so with heroin, what we're seeing, it's very, very much more nuanced, where more often than not, there's a milk run, as I call it, to Baltimore or Philadelphia or New York, where someone just drives to there rather than someone coming here to set up shop, and purchasing a bunch of it and coming back and either selling it or sharing it with other users of it. And so the definition of dealer becomes much more complex, because someone in that situation,
they're a user too,
is introducing a lot of heroin into this county, but they're using it as well. So that's when I say it's nuanced from a judgment call perspective. It becomes tricky. And so again, in that, sometimes we have 4 different people going to Baltimore and coming back, and then one person gets this amount and goes here. Something bad may or may not happen. Figuring out what happened and who's proportionally involved in that is tricky. And so when I've been deployed, I've had the opportunity to work with some really professional, elite types of folks. And one of the terms they talk about is the heart and the fist. And so, in the deployed environment, bear with me, if you're overseas as a member of the armed forces and you're interacting with people in the local government and local communities, you want them to sort of buy into what you're doing. Hearts and minds kind of a thing. You may have heard that reference before. And so you're doing things in that community. You're helping orphanages. You're providing medical services, that sort of thing, building schools, fixing roads, plumbing, that kind of stuff. And you're doing it as a human because it's just the right thing to do. But also psychologically, it's better for your overall mission that they understand you're not there to occupy that country forever.
Right. You're an ally.
And they will give you information as to where the actual bad guys are. And then you do the fist thing, where there's the heart and the fist, where it's also a component here where we are more thoughtful, I think, than we've ever been about who's got a dependency issue with this drug. However, there's still that trafficking component. And again, if you think about it in terms of the fist, there's traditional trafficking investigations. And when we have so many people dying now, it becomes that much more, there's that much more motivation. You could say maybe when it was crack, where he had many, fewer overdoses and certainly deaths. And now with so many deaths, it just becomes a much more driven and time sensitive, quite frankly, investigation, because the sooner that gets distributed, the more likely it is that someone in the community, someone's son, daughter, spouse is maybe going to die. Yeah. So it becomes that much more time sensitive, and there's that much more pressure with that. Yeah.
Do you know, by virtue of when the police start getting calls, that the drugs have hit the streets? Are you that sensitive to what goes on? Is there kind of like we're starting to get these calls, we're getting overdoses? Are you able to tie that to these milk runs?
I can tell you that the biggest change we've had is the number of deaths. And so with that, we now have homicide investigations. Right. Where we used to have drug delivery, drug trafficking investigations, trying to stay ahead of that distribution and using intelligence networks here and outside of the county to coordinate in that sort of way. Now, one thing that's different these days, unfortunately, is that we have the potential of a homicide investigation and potential charge, and it's very time sensitive as to when that evidence is collected. It can go stale rather quickly. It's interesting even with the Get Back Up initiative, where we've opened up the doors to the police department to help people. There's a lot of distrust built up.
Sure.
That we're breaking through. There's sort of we talk about stigma with someone who's using drugs and how the community may view them. There's also sort of that stigma between law enforcement and those in the community, who may have had a prior experience with law enforcement. And so there's that distrust there. And so when we're investigating either a standard delivery or trafficking or one of these deliveries that have resulted in someone's death, people aren't always inclined to help the police.
Right.
That's sort of the reality of what it's like out there. And so, and now we have a Good Samaritan law, which I don't know if that was on the paper. I suspect it wasn't, but there is a Good Samaritan law that I think the spirit of which is something that I totally understand and don't disagree with in terms of the spirit. But what it does is it encourages someone who's at the scene of an overdose event to get medical attention. And so recognizing that someone who's participating along with someone could be found with potential paraphernalia or drug items when official folks
they could go to jail.
Get there. Yeah, so it's prohibitive for them to seek help for somebody else. And so the law says if you make that call and you stay, you're immune from criminal liability, as is the person who is experiencing the overdose event, obviously presuming that person survives. And so again, I understand the spirit of that. What it's done sometimes, though, is prohibit us from helping that person in a sense at times, because we are attacking this problem with perhaps what would be referred to as a bit more humanity, if you will. Sometimes people don't want help.
Right, no, they want to keep using drugs.
And I'll tell you, I swear, I'm raising my right hand for the record, for those of you who can't see it. I have not spoken to, there's not been a person I've spoken to who's in long-term recovery who hasn't said, thank God for jail and the police, or I'd be dead. Right. And I wish it didn't have to be like that, But so the one thing with the Good Samaritan law is that I guess the negative part of it is that someone cannot be influenced or compelled to get help. Yeah. So understanding the spirit of that law, that we want people to make the call so that the person doesn't perish. They're not perishing, but they're not, we may be there tomorrow because they haven't had that intervention of treatment.
Right. Moving on through more of the treatment and recovery.
Sure.
Let's talk about treatment court. So tell us about that, what it means. Is it working? Let's get into that.
Definitely. It's about a year into it. We started last spring with treatment court. It's certainly not anything that Franklin County invented. It's been around for 20, 30 years, I think, nationally. So it's nothing that we just came up with and are taking credit for. But we just started it here. We focused on those who have an opioid addiction. They're identified as early as possible. And it's interesting because this is something the DA's office has been doing for probably 2 or 3 or more years before treatment court. We had partnered with an entity called Gaudensia who would come into court weekly, and we would identify individuals who were defendants in cases who may need some sort of a treatment.
If I can just interrupt
sure.
quickly. Gaudensia is a treatment center.
It is.
For drug and alcohol addiction.
3 different states that they operate in. I believe 30 plus different types of facilities, all different kinds. Some specializing in, for example, treatment centers for mothers and their children can be there. Some for those with co-occurring mental health needs there. So we had partnered with them, and they came down and began to assess some of the folks that we identified with a quick screen, and then helped us get them into treatment. Then we would sort of factor that into someone's overall disposition of their case. But our primary emphasis for many years now was to get that person some help. It's interesting. Oftentimes a victim in a case is a family member in a situation like this. And that it's probably the 3rd, 4th, 5th time that person's been victimized by their loved one, oftentimes a theft, and something being pawned, for money to buy more drugs. So they have some level of guilt unnecessarily, but they do because it's a loved one, and
family,
now they're sending them to jail potentially, and where does this end up now? They're going to continue to spiral. And so now with what we were doing with Gaudenzia, now with treatment court, I think those families can feel more confident, obviously, and with Get Back Up, quite frankly, that they can feel more confident that their loved one's going to get help. So we were certainly influenced by the idea of victims often coming in to us asking us to do this, and it's sort of the reason we do what we do. It's the reason I do what I do is essentially I want to help someone get justice. If something happened to them that shouldn't have happened, and I sort of want to champion them and make sure someone's held accountable for what happened to this person. And so we have 44 individuals in treatment court now. After that assessment is done and someone is, for example, recommended for an inpatient facility, oftentimes it's a longer term. With heroin, given the nature of it, it's often at least a 90-day inpatient residential setting, and then back out into the community, which is, Noah's House has worked very well and in concert with treatment court. There's a number of participants in treatment court that are at Noah's House. But they come into court, they plead guilty to their offense, and oftentimes they're coming out of jail into that treatment environment. So they're being released from jail to a treatment bed and then back out in the community, oftentimes Noah's House, as I said. And so what happens then is it's different than from regular supervision. So oftentimes when someone is on parole or probation, they have periodic check-ins with a probation officer. Right. There's urinalysis occurring, that sort of thing. Sure. With treatment court, that's just much more frequent. And we have a team of individuals that meet every 2 weeks prior to court. It's me from the DA's office, President Judge Van Horn from the court. She's the presiding judge. Our SCA, as we referred to earlier, her name's April Brown. She's our drug and alcohol supervisor here for the county. We have someone from Gaudenzia there who does the assessments. We have our treatment team coordinator. We have a public defender, one probation officer dedicated to all these cases, and then we have someone from the law enforcement community there to represent. So we talk about all of their cases in detail. In painstaking detail,
and that's a lot of different perspectives
it really
being
is.
Brought to bear.
We're used, yes, that, and for me, for the public defender, for the judge, it's typical for us to have a case come through ultimately to a sentence, and once that final sentence occurs, we don't really expect to see that person, or we don't see that person, obviously, unless there's another criminal event. But so we don't know what happens after they leave the courthouse. Right. Are they doing all right? Are they not?
Getting ready to reoffend, maybe.
Right. And so they come in every 2 weeks then to court and meet with Judge Van Horn. And she would have received that update prior to court, but we're all going over all of the updates for everything they might need. And so we really have a focused effort on these specific individuals to set them up for the best success. We select what we call the highest risk and highest need individuals. So we're betting on long shots here, quite frankly, and it's been very fulfilling. It's quite different for me. As I said, I don't usually know exactly what happens with individuals once they leave court, and now when you see someone at their proverbial rock bottom, which is a term we don't really like to use anymore, but you see someone at one of their lowest points.
Right. And
then go to treatment, come back, are engaging in recovery, working that recovery process. They're different people. There's a metamorphosis you're watching every 2 weeks, and they just keep getting better and better. And there's lots of components to include, employment, family situations, and it all comes up. And to hear people, and there's folks that are in treatment court that we've had encounters with perhaps many, many times previously, and to hear them talk about their past and their future, more importantly, it's pretty uplifting. It's not all roses. Not everyone is successful.
Oh, I'm sure.
And so treatment court's a little different. I don't know what the best word is to use. Tolerant comes to mind, but we sort of expect that this isn't necessarily going to go perfectly. There are penalties.
You're dealing with
involved.
Human beings.
Yeah, for sure. It's all humanity. That's what I love about my job. It's flesh and blood. So, people, when they have missteps, or the reverse of that, if they have successes, they're recognized. And so the missteps are not generally good events in someone's life on the receiving end, but they're not necessarily given up on, and so that the behavior is going to be addressed. But then they're back into this what we call our pack. It's Good Wolf Treatment Court, and the reason we call it Good Wolf Treatment Court is because of an old Cherokee parable, which goes like this: a young Cherokee is troubled and has what we would really call anxiety, is troubled by something, and is very upset, and eventually goes to the head of the Cherokee tribe and the chief, and expresses this anxiety and this troubled situation, and the chief reflects on it and says to the young Cherokee, well, what's happening is inside of you there's two wolves, and there's a struggle. They're fighting right now. There's a fight. There's a good wolf and a bad wolf, and they're inside all of us. So I'm familiar with what you're going through. We all have to go through this at some point. There's a good wolf that represents joy, love, peace, all of the good things. There's a bad wolf that represents violence, hate, jealousy, greed, all those sorts of things. And they struggle inside of you. And when they're fighting for you. And when that happens, you feel the way you're feeling right now. And so that's what's happening. And so the young boy contemplated that and said to the chief, so which wolf wins the fight? And the chief says, the one that you feed. And so the theme then for Good Wolf Treatment Court isn't just that we want these individuals to not break the law. That's a really low bar. Right? It's not hard to not get in trouble. Right. It's a pretty reasonable standard to expect. What we found, what I believe, is that when someone is focused on something positive rather than not doing the negative, they're much more likely to have success. And so a lot of court really is very similar to raising a child. And I don't mean that dismissively either, but a lot of it just intellectually the way you
raising
approach
a child
it.
is
Yes, it can be intellectually challenging to figure out what if you want a certain outcome or behavior, what's the smartest way to get that person to buy in, really. And so for a child, when you say something is forbidden,
they want it.
It becomes the most interesting thing ever in the world. And so what the good wolf concept means is that, join something that's positive. This may be the first time you've ever done this in your life, just given your history. And so chances are you start to build relationships with people who are also doing these positive things, and chances are you don't want to let them down.
Right.
And chances are you're going to be busy enough concentrating on giving back to the community that you're not going to really even have time to focus on anything negative.
That brings me to the final aspect of this rehabilitation. We're going to leave the law enforcement component alone for the purpose of this conversation, but aftercare, continued rehabilitation, employment, do you have any programs to help people? Because, once that, they got to check that box on the employment form and write, what happened. I've been in that situation where reviewing applications, and you have to take a bit of a jaundiced eye to those applicants. So is there anything your office or any of these programs are doing to kind of, because what you're talking about is, gainful employment is a big part of, I think, self-esteem and having purpose, as you talk about, maybe feeding that good wolf.
Concur.
So are you involved in that, or do you have programs that are involved in that?
Within treatment court, we do have, as part of that sort of holistic approach to it, there are certainly attempts made to help those individuals seek meaningful employment. And so what I mean by meaningful is there's having a job and there's having something that's sort of something that will give you a sustainable income, long lasting. And so employment's important. But we're also sort of careful about just getting a job.
Right.
Education is another concern of mine, and there's potentially some of those same barriers with federal student aid assistance, with those kinds of backgrounds. And so I'm very interested in the idea of not only these 44 individuals in treatment court, but some of the other ones that we've worked with over the years and will continue to. I'm interested in them putting a ceiling to what they can do, and thinking that those sorts of opportunities, that job, whatever that would be in quotes, or going to college and getting that to a particular degree, whatever it would be that they would prefer, is unattainable. We want to change that mindset, and because that's some of that same mindset that has maybe kept them in this environment,
exactly.
And affected their self-esteem.
What's the point? I can't achieve anything, so why not, slip back into the old lifestyle?
That's right.
So, all right. Well, we're about to wrap up, but I'd like to end on a high note if we could.
Sure.
Do you feel like you have some control over the situation in Franklin County, or what is your feeling right now?
I can tell you, to keep it on a positive note, I would start by saying that Franklin County, quite candidly, was very far behind with respect to treatment options, to that recovery base here. I can tell you that while we have a lot of work to do, that we've done a lot of work in a pretty short amount of time, but we still have a lot of work to do. But there are people in the community, people that are involved with the overdose task force, people in law enforcement, quite frankly, who are thinking about things a lot differently than they ever did before. So I'm very confident that with that continued spirit in this community, that we'll continue to get better and better and see fewer and fewer overdoses. Yeah,
good. I don't think it's the analogy in my mind is it's almost like a tsunami where the water drained out and no one knew it was coming, and then all of a sudden everyone was dealing with this opioid epidemic. So don't be too hard on yourself for maybe not being caught up. Listen, thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
It was a great conversation. I hope you'll come back sometime and we can talk about other topics. And now I'm going to throw over to Producer Jeremy.
Producer Jeremy here. Just a reminder, in case we do get this podcast posted in time, that there is a second Saturday event, a Common Grounds event at the Coil Free Library on Saturday at 10 a.m., and the guest speaker will be none other than Matt Fogal, our guest today. So go check him out in person. And the Common Grounds events at the library every second Saturday are put on by the Franklin County Coalition for Progress. You can find more information on these and so much more at fccforprogress.org. Also, we're working on a show for next week. What do we have, Pete?
Grand Source Power Line. We're going to be talking with the people who are spearheading the organization to stop the power line from coming through Franklin County. This is a big topic. This is about private property. This is about eminent domain. This is about the small guy versus the big guy. So you're going to want to tune into that show.
Yeah, and then the May 26th is the opening day for the farmers market in downtown Chambersburg. So the week prior to the opening there, we're going to try to have a show about the farmers market.
Yeah, so, talk to the good people at the farmers market.
The week after next. Yeah. So we've got that, and with that, I guess we'll sign off. We'll remind people that we can be found at progresspod.org on iTunes. Go into the iTunes store and search for Progress Pod. You can subscribe to us there. And we're also on SoundCloud.
And the best Twitter feed on the internet, at Progress Pod.
If you say so.
Check it out.
At The Progress Pod.
At The Progress Pod.
All right.
I just tweet. I don't know. All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.